Friends, Shubho Durga Puja. Enjoy, but be safe and stay well. This is our sixth webinar in the financial year 21-22. Today our topic is tax audit, discussion on legal issues. And our speaker is CA Ramesh Kumar Patodia. CA Patodia was our speaker on reassessment also, and we are very much grateful that he has again consented to join us. Though date of tax audit has been extended, still we felt that legal issues should be discussed earlier, as that will help the members to perform their duty more diligently. So without wasting any more time, I will hand over the proceedings to CA Indu Chatra, convener of the study circle, to take us forward. Thank you. Wish you for a very best puja. Indra, please come in.
Thank you, Anil, and good evening to all my fellow colleagues in the profession. Before I introduce the speaker of this evening, let me wish each and everyone the season's greetings, Durga Puja, thereafter Lakhi Puja, and to follow Kali Puja. Though Mr. C.A. Ramesh Patodia does not require any introduction, but as a ritual, it is always better to say a few words about the speaker. Ramesh Kumar Patodia is in continuous practice as a chartered accountant in the city of Joy, Kolkata, for last 34 years, and has been practicing mainly in consultancy and litigations in the field of direct and indirect taxes, FEMA, etc. He is a regular speaker on several professional organizations and is a regular contributor to various publications by way of articles on professional topics. He has also written several books on professional topics, including commentary on Hindu, undivided family, and a complete guide on reassessment under Section 148 of the Income Tax Act, etc. He is also the co-chairman of the Tax Council of ASSOCHAM, Eastern Region. He is also a trustee of Shri Rani Sati Mandir, Junjuna, and Gayatri Foundations, Kolkata. With these few words, I introduce and place before you the learned speaker of the evening, Ramesh Kumar Patodia. Please, Ramesh.
Thank you, Induda. I am really, what to say, overwhelmed at being introduced by none other than our great Induda. And I am feeling what to be amongst the members of Accountants Library and delivering lecture on this important topic, that is tax audit and legal issues, friends. As Mr. Anindranath said, that the dates for tax audit got extended and everybody has got a breather, so to say. This year we can enjoy the Puja and Diwali and without any tension of filing of reports and returns, etc. So for that, I think we must thank those in the North Block for having taken an early decision regarding the extending of the dates. Friends, this tax audit, let us come to the topic straight away. Tax audit was introduced, as all of us know, in the year 1984 by Honorable Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who was the finance minister at that time, if I remember correctly. And so the tax audit is being done for last almost 35 years, more than 35 years, I think, that chartered accountants are doing tax audit. And the format of tax audit, if you see the form number 3CD, which is the basic form in which the information is required to be given, that has been amended gradually over the years to incorporate the changes which are being made in the Income Tax Act. And the tax audit, which was initially seen to be an audit which will help the assessing officer in completion of the assessment, because basically the tax auditor's role is to find out that what are the deviations which have been made by an assessee as far as compliance with the Income Tax Act is concerned while computing his total income. And this is the only area, friends, I think, which when a chartered accountant does tax audit, he is supposed to know the audit as well as tax. Unless he knows both the things, he will not be able to do the tax audit properly. So friends, recently I was a part of one committee which was formed by ICAI with other respected senior members from Calcutta to look into the few tax audit reports of big corporates. And when we did the review sort of thing for the tech, for those on those reports, we found out certain silly mistakes which were made in those reports. So today, during the course of discussion, friends, I will be dealing with two aspects. One aspect is, of course, the legal issue, by which I mean that when one is handling the tax audit, one cannot remain aloof to the legal world. Basically, the cases which are being delivered by the various high courts and Supreme Court, one has to be aware about those cases while handling the assignment related to tax audit. And secondly, some of the important points which one must take into account while completing the tax audits, friends. These are the two issues on which I will base my discussion. And thereafter, we can take up the questions, if any. And moreover, let me point out, friends, I don't personally do very many audits because we are basically into taxation and other matters. So the procedural aspects I won't be dealing with much as far as procedural aspects of tax audit is concerned. So now, friends, let us come straight away to the, when I say legal issues, I will take up one very important point in the tax audit form. I will come straight away to form number 3CD. And in form number 3CD, friends, there is one requirement regarding the ICDS, Income Computation and Disclosure Standards. As all of you know, Section 145 of the Income Tax Act was amended a few years ago, where the central government amended the Income Tax Act Section 145 by providing that the income has to be computed in accordance with the income computation and disclosure standards which are notified by the central government. And central government has notified 10 income computation and disclosure standards so far. One ICDS on real estate, the draft ICDS for that was placed in the public domain, but that has not yet been notified. So as far as real estate developers and companies who are constructing real estate, for them, there is no ICDS specifically for them. Now, as a tax auditor, friends, if you see the form number 3CD, the tax auditor is required to report on the disclosures which are required to be made as far as tax audit is concerned. That because in all the ICDS, if you see, there is a requirement regarding the disclosures to be made by the company or the SSC, as the case may be. And then effect of the effect of ICDS on the profit and loss of the SSC in relation to ICDS. Invariably, friends, I have found during the course of my limited interaction with the reports that the reporting is not being done properly as far as ICDS point is concerned. In what form? First is, suppose out of 10 ICDS, few are applicable, few are not applicable, but you are not reporting on the ICDS which are applicable to the SSC. You are keeping silent in the tax audit report. Whereas from the other material, it can be seen that there should have been reporting on that aspect. That is one, which is of course a glaring kind of a mistake if one does. Secondly, friends, if you see the ICDS, then in respect of the ICDS itself, there are certain issues which are not yet resolved, and while doing the attest function, a chartered accountant has to face a dilemma while reporting in respect of ICDS. How? I'll take you to 2-3 things in this regard. First of all, friends, ICDS 1, if we know, deals with the disclosure of accounting policies. And as in relation to the accounting standard, all of us know AS1 is dealing with the disclosure of the accounting policy. And AS1, all of us know that while preparation of the accounts of any SSC, 3 things are to be followed: prudence and materiality and going concern. These are 3 important pillars, so to say, that whenever you are preparing the accounts, these 3 things must be followed, and it is auditor's responsibility to see that they are followed. If they are not followed, then one is supposed to qualify the accounts. But if you compare the AS1 with ICDS 1, which deals with the accounting policies, the ICDS does not want prudence to be adopted in preparation of at least the income tax return and computation. I fail to understand that how ICDS can say that you have to account for an item as income or loss or expenditure, even if it is not prudent. Because the very basis of any computation of income is the income. If there is no income, then that item cannot be part of the computation. What I mean is, friends, that even though ICDS may say that it is your income, but that does not make it your income unless it is the income as understood in the manner as interpreted by various courts, including Supreme Court, friends. In the case of Surji Ballabh Das 46 ITR, the very famous case, where Supreme Court said that unless you are certain of receiving an item of income, you cannot bring it to tax. Hypothetical receipts cannot be taken into account. However, the way ICDS 1 is asking you, an item which may not result into income is also being asked to be taken into account as income. For example, retention money in a construction contract, all of us know that retention money is involved. Since the construction contract, the result of the construction contract you cannot see immediately, and it may take 1 year or 2 years to know that whether the construction was done properly or not. And therefore, generally the contractors will not be paid immediately the entire amount, and a percentage will be retained, which is called the retention money. And it is settled law that retention money cannot be treated as income unless and until it is certain that the amount will be received by you. There is a Calcutta High Court decision on this point. The case of Simplex Concrete Pipe, reported in 179 ITR page 8, where Calcutta High Court held so. But if you see ICDS 3 says that retention money has to be taken as income, notwithstanding the fact that you are not certain to receive it. In such a situation, friends, why one is reporting the effect of ICDS in the tax audit report? Going by the language of the ICDS, the auditor will definitely be required to report that this amount has not been taken into account in computing the income. However, in my opinion, this has to be properly explained in the observation part of the report, that even though this amount is being taken as income in view of the requirements of ICDS, but the same is not to be included in the computation of income. This is one point regarding the prudence, friends. Then secondly, friends, there is a glaring inconsistency, I would say, regarding the manner of computation of the stock in trade in case of securities. In the ICDS 8, which deals with accounting for investments, And this ICDS is applicable in case of those SSEs who are dealing in securities as part of their business. And what does this ICDS says, friends? This ICDS says that in respect of a person who is engaged in dealing in shares and securities, as far as the valuation of stock in trade of securities is concerned, Section 145 subclause A, Section 145 subsection A of the Income Tax Act prescribes, I will come to that section, friends. Section 145A subclause 3, no sorry, subclause 4 deals with the inventory of securities which are listed. It has to be done at lower of actual cost or net realizable value. Fair enough. Lower of cost or net realizable value, this is the standard method of valuation of stock in trade, which was prescribed, which was upheld by Supreme Court in the case of Chainroop Sampatram 24 ITR page 481, which judgment we are still following. But here, friends, if you see the ICDS 8, ICDS 8 says that you have to, well, when you are taking the cost and when you are comparing it with the NRV, you have to compare on the basis of the block of that particular item. What does that mean? That means suppose if you have 100 shares, 100 company shares with you, then you don't have to compare each company's shares with NRV. Rather, you take the total cost of all the 100 companies and total NRV of all the 100 companies and compare that total. This is what is prescribed in the ICDS 8, which is totally absurd. If you make a computation in this manner, it is invariably going to give you a income, the value of the stock at a figure which is higher than the stock at which it should have been valued if it was done at cost or NRV, whichever is lower. I have got examples with me, but I am not sharing because of the, there are other issues to be dealt with. So friends, in such a situation, again, when the tax auditor is confronted with a situation like this, where if he follows the ICDS, this has to be done like this, but which is totally against the principles of income, the manner in which income has to be taken, principle of prudence. And here again, friends, in my opinion, the fact has to be properly disclosed by way of a note and observation in the report. Otherwise, what I have seen, that whenever tax audit is done by the auditors, the assessing officers will invariably, if any adverse remark has been given in the tax audit report, the assessing officer will invariably agree with that adverse remark and make the adjustment or addition based on the tax auditor's audit report. However, if the tax auditor has given any positive comment about any particular item, then the assessing officer does not take it on face value. He will do his own inquiry, etc., before accepting that, which is not, I think, this particular point is also during our internal discussion, I had pointed out that, look, if the tax auditor's report is, the government has asked the tax auditors to give report, then their report should be followed, and whatever comments, whatever disclosures, whatever observations have been made, they should be followed in totality, and they should, the assessing officer should not again examine those things. This is my view, to give a more statutory teeth, so to say, to the tax audit. And third point, friends, again in relation to ICDS, is regarding the provisions. Provisions and liabilities. Sometimes what happens that when you are preparing the accounts, the company may make a provision of an item, of an expenditure, which it is 100% sure of incurring the expenditure. And one may take a view that this expenditure is not an actual liability, it is a contingent liability. And therefore, it has to be reflected in the relevant column where particulars of contingent liability, if any, is required to be disclosed in the tax audit report. So here, friends, again, the auditor has to exercise his wisdom and prudence and judgment to see that whether the liability is really a contingent liability or not. In this regard, friends, I will give two decisions which are very important decisions on this particular issue. One is a very old decision of Calcutta High Court reported in 37 ITR page 1 in the case of Calcutta Company Limited versus CIT. And second decision is the decision of Supreme Court reported in 180 Taxman 422 in the case of Roto RK Controls India Private Limited. I will explain, friends, these two decisions. Let us discuss in few words. The first decision is the Calcutta High Court decision of 1959, where the company was engaged in the business of developing land, carrying on land developing business. It was purchasing land and it was developing those land and then selling those land. Now, in the course of its development, say, it has made some sales of the land and the company booked some expenditure which it thought that it would have to incur for the purpose of development of the land which it has already sold. And the question arose whether the expenditure on proposed development was an actual expenditure or it was a contingent expenditure. And in that context, friends, the Calcutta High Court decided in favor of the company that whatever expenditure it had to do, that was
নিচে আছি
that cannot be said contingent expenditure. It is allowable as a expenditure, notwithstanding that the it is only a provision, the amount based on some estimate. It is not that there is no party who has supplied the material or bill. It is a best estimate of the company. It is not a contingent liability, it is an actual liability. Similarly, friends, in the case of Roto RK Controls, Justice Kapadia delivered this judgment. And again here, friends, it's a very important judgment in relation to provisions and liabilities, contingent liability also. In this judgment, friends, in paragraph 10, Justice Kapadia has written, I am reading few lines. What is a provision? It says a provision is a liability which can be measured only by using a substantial degree of estimation. A provision is recognized when an enterprise has a present obligation as a result of past event. It is probable that an outflow of resources will be required to settle the obligation. A reliable estimate can be made of the amount of the obligation. If these conditions are not met, no provision can be recognized. And then it went on to say a past event is, what is the past event? And past event that leads to present obligation is called an obligating event. This case was related to the provision for warranty expenses. You see, whenever we are buying, say when I'm buying an Apple iPhone for say 1,50,000 now, they are asking me to, they are giving me an option to buy the additional warranty also for say 1 year extra warranty, and 1 year warranty is already covered within the cost of the iPhone. So now when I am buying the this iPhone for 1,50,000 with 1 year warranty, the company is supposed to give the warranty for next 1 year, for which it may have to replace the phone also. It may have to repair, it has to maintain infrastructure for that, it has to maintain a stock of parts. There are several costs involved with the maintenance of the warranty. It is not sure, one cannot say that whether what kind of expenditure will be incurred. But it is sure that the company will have to incur some expenditure in respect of the past events, that is the past sale. That is why Supreme Court said a past event that leads to a present obligation is called an obligating event. So therefore, the company, in this case RotoRK, it was dealing with a particular product, and going by its experience, it made a provision for certain expenses to be incurred in meeting those obligations of warranty. In some of the industry's friends, the warranty can extend to even 5 years, or there are certain things in respect of which the company give lifetime guarantee, or warranty of say 25 years, 5 years. So basically, when you have given that kind of assurance, so based on your experience, you make a provision for certain expenses. Then the question arises whether it is a provision, whether it is a contingent liability, or it is a actual liability, which you are eligible to claim as deduction under section 37 of the Income Tax Act. And while reporting in the tax audit form 3CD, where one is expected to report regarding particulars of contingent liability, if any, again here the management, suppose, decides that no, it is not a contingent liability, but it is my actual liability, then here the auditor will have to exercise his prudence again and judgment in going through those provisions and to take a call that what is the call of the management, whether that is correct or incorrect, and to give his observations in keeping with the various decisions of the Supreme Court and other courts. So friends, as far as the reporting regarding the ICDS is concerned, the gist of the matter is that there are still difficulties while reporting in relation to ICDS. by the tax auditors, and reporting should be done very properly, because one must not forget section 271J of the Income Tax Act, where incorrect reporting can lead to penal provisions on the auditors also. Now that is a part of the statute book. Casually the auditors are not writing anything regarding these disclosures, or reporting on some, not reporting on some. That is not correct in my opinion, friends. The next point, which is to be the next point of discussion on this, is regarding the valuation of inventory. Valuation of inventory, friends, again in the tax audit form, this is an important point which is required to be reported by the auditor. What does the reporting requirement says? This ICDS part is in item number 13, I think 13E and 13F, that deals with the ICDS part. As far as the inventory part is concerned, clause number 14A says method of valuation of closing stock employed in the previous year. And then next 14B says in case of deviation from the method of valuation prescribed under section 145A and the effect thereof on the profit or loss, please furnish the increase in profit and decrease, etc. So clause number 14A talks about the method of valuation of stock, closing stock, and deviation from the method of valuation prescribed under section 145A. Now friends, let us come back to 145 and 145A. 145 is method of accounting. As I told earlier, that income from business has to be computed in accordance with the method of accounting followed by the SSE, which is mercantile basis or cash basis, because here I am given the option to, I can follow cash basis also or mercantile basis. And ICDS, of course, let all of you know that if I am following cash basis, then ICDS is not applicable. Now friends, 145A, what does it say? It says for the purpose of determining income chargeable under the head profit and gains of business or profession, the valuation of inventory shall be made at lower of actual cost or net realizable value, computed in accordance with the income computation and disclosure standards notified under section 145 subsection 2. So here also the inventory has to be valued at cost or market price, whichever is net realizable value, whichever is lower, as per ICDS 2, dealing with valuation of inventory. In this regard, friends, there are three important decisions of Supreme Court. The first decision, as I told you earlier, is the decision of Chenrup Sampatram, reported in 24 ITR page 481. This Chenrup Sampatram, the Honorable Supreme Court made certain important observation that what is the purpose of valuing the stock in trade. The Supreme Court said that it is wrong to assume that the valuation of closing stock at market rate has for its objects the bringing into charge any appreciation in the value of such stock. The true purpose of crediting the value of unsold stock is to balance the cost of those goods entered on the other side of the account at the time of their purchase, so that the cancelling out of the entries relating to the same stock from both the sides would leave only the transactions on which they have been actual sales. What does the Supreme Court said in this? That when you are putting the value of stock in trade on the credit side of the profit and loss account, its only purpose is to cancel out the effect of the debit side where you have entered the purchases of the stock and nothing else. In this case, what happened? It's a case related to the British India period, when there was a British India and India. British India, there was a tax, and in India, there was no tax. So here, Calcutta was in British India in those days, and Bikaner in Rajasthan was not in British India. It was an Indian state. And if the particular firm in this case, they did some tax planning where the partners transferred the stock of 582 kg silver in those days to Bikaner by transferring the stock of 582 kg silver at cost price, and the assessing officer took the market value of 582 kg silver, which came to 2 lakh rupees in those days, and he charged tax on that. And in that context, the Supreme Court was pronouncing the judgment in the Chainroop Sampath-Ram's case, friends. This Chainroop Sampath-Ram's case later on came up for discussion before Honorable Supreme Court again in the case of CIT versus British Paint India Limited, reported in 188 ITR, page 44. In this case, friends, what was the question before the Honorable Apex Court? That how cost is to be computed. When you are valuing the stock at cost, what is the component of the cost? Here Supreme Court said that component of cost will include overhead expenditure also in relation to the stock in trade. And Supreme Court here in paragraph 19 and 20 of the judgment made certain important observations. In relation to section 145, I am reading few lines from the judgment. Section 145 confers sufficient power upon the officer. Nay, it imposes a duty upon him to make such computation in such manner as he determines for deducing the correct profit and gains. This means that where accounts are prepared without disclosing the real cost of the stock in trade, albeit on sound expert advice in the interest of efficient administration, it is the duty of the assessing officer to determine the taxable income by making such computation as he thinks fit. And then in paragraph 20 also Supreme Court said, basically Supreme Court said, we all know method of accounting. When we are following a method of accounting, say, regarding the valuation of stock in trade, then we say that we are consistently following this method of accounting. However, consistency in following a particular method of accounting must not be confused with the correct method of accounting. If the method which you have followed is incorrect and the income cannot be computed correctly in view of the method of accounting which you have followed, then the assessing officer can disturb the method of accounting which you have followed. This is what the Supreme Court basically said in the judgment of British Paint 188 ITR. And for section 145 even now says so that the assessing officer, when the assessing officer is not satisfied about the correctness or completeness of the accounts, or where the method of accounting has not been regularly followed, or the income has not been computed in accordance with the standards ICDS, the assessing officer may make assessment under 144. See, the AO has got power under 145 to see that method of accounting which you have followed is correct and consistently followed. Then friends, the last judgment in this series is the judgment of Supreme Court again in the case of Hindustan Zinc Limited, CIT versus Hindustan Zinc Limited, reported in 291 ITR page 391, where again Justice Kapadia, in this case friends, an important an important issue came up where Hindustan Zinc was producing zinc concentrate, and what it did, while adapting the formula of cost or NRV whichever is lower, because cost or NRV whichever is lower is universally followed while valuing the stock in trade, while taking the figure of NRV, net realizable value, it saw that the NRV, if it took the value as per the international prices of zinc concentrate, which was prevailing on the London Metal Exchange, LME, that was lower than the prices which were prevailing in the domestic market. Therefore, for the purpose of NRV, it adopted the value as per the international prices of zinc. And on that basis, it computed the stock in trade. In that context, friends, the department took up the matter before Supreme Court that no, while comparing the cost and NRV, you have to take the value of the zinc concentrate based on the rate of the zinc concentrate in the domestic market, which you have been consistently doing for last so many years. Because in this case, the auditors reported that the company has valued the zinc concentrate at the LME prices, due to which the profit was reduced by 27 crores in this case. And Supreme Court in this judgment, after discussing the decisions in the case of Chenrup, Sampatram and Berger Paint, British Paint 188 ITR, which I just now said that while taking the NRV, you have to do it by taking the NRV at the domestic prices. You cannot reduce it by the anticipated profit or anticipated loss that you will be making while selling in the international market as against the domestic market. That is the point which was decided by Supreme Court in this judgment, friends. And against this, the review petition was also filed by Hindustan Zinc, but that was also rejected by Supreme Court. So, when we discuss these three decisions of Supreme Court, which are pillars, so to say, in respect of the valuation of stock in trade, as insofar as a tax auditor is concerned, while reporting regarding item number 14A regarding method of valuation of closing stock and the deviation from the method of valuation prescribed under 145A, the effect of these judgments has to be taken into account, in my opinion. Closing stock is one item which generally I have seen that lot of auditors will rely on the certificate given by the management, and management writes that we have valued the stock in trade, and we take management representation, and on that basis the valuation is accepted as correct, which I think should be avoided. It is the duty of the auditor to see to it that the method of valuation, the way it has been done, the ICDS, whatever prescribes FIFO method, LIFO method, weighted average, all those details I'm not going into. Those things, including the effect of the judgments which I have just now placed before this August House should be followed instead of relying on a blanket certificate of the management, which would be fatal, because though the Supreme Court in Chain Rup Sampath Ram has said that the purpose of stock in trade is not to, stock in trade cannot generate profit, but the figure of stock in trade, all of you will agree, is one figure which can be tweaked to increase or reduce the profits in a profit and loss account. That is very important. This is second point which is very important in my opinion. Then friends, the third point which I would like to discuss is regarding 14A. 14A, as all of us know, expenditure in relation to an exempt income is required to be added under section 14A. And the auditor is supposed to report regarding the amount of expenditure which is to be disallowed in relation to 14A. Again, 14A disallowance is one of the most tricky and litigated issue. Computation in accordance with Rule 8D of the income tax rules has to be made. Dear friends, recently there was a decision of Supreme Court in the case of South Indian Bank Limited, which was pronounced on 9th of September 2021. And this is one of it's a very good judgment, I will say, in relation to section 14A of the Income Tax Act. Where what happened, the Honorable Supreme Court was considering the appeal of the bank, South Indian Bank, where it had invested money in some investments out of the money lying in its bank account. And the department contended that the amount has been invested out of the borrowed funds, whereas the SSC contended that amount has not been invested out of borrowed funds. I have got only one account where I am putting borrowed funds also, I am putting my own funds also. All the funds are being put up in one account which is indivisible account. And therefore, taking into account on an overall basis, if my capital and free reserves is more than the investments which I have made, then it should be held that I have made the investment out of own funds, not out of borrowed funds. And in that relation, friends, Supreme Court correctly analyzed the position when it said that the law does not require the SSC to maintain separate accounts for the earning of exempt income and non-exempt income. And the argument of the department, therefore, that this has come from borrowed funds and it has been invested in exempt income, Supreme Court did not buy that argument. Supreme Court said that right of appropriation, important point, right of appropriation and right to assert what part of fund a particular investment was made from lies with the SSC. If I have invested some money, then whether that has been invested out of my own funds or my borrowed funds, the right of appropriation and the right to assert lies with the SSC. And therefore, on that basis, Supreme Court held that there was no disallowance which could have been made under section 14A in that case. Latest decision on 9th of September 2021. So friends, whenever the disclosures are made regarding the amount to be disallowed under section 14A, the implication of this judgment will obviously be there. And if it is a judgment of Supreme Court, then one cannot say, the department also cannot say that we will not agree, we will appeal against this judgment. They cannot say. So therefore this should be taken into account while reporting in relation to the particular clause of 14A. And straight away, if on an overall basis there is no disallowance which is sought, which can be done, then the auditor is entitled to take that view. At best, it can give an observation in the report that we have taken into account the decision of this Supreme Court in South Indian Bank's case, and on that basis we report that there is no amount is required to be added in relation to section 14A of the Income Tax Act. Now another point, important point again, is in relation to section 36(1) subclause 5A, which is regarding the delay in making payment for the towards employees' contribution to the provident fund. Employees' contribution to the provident fund, as we know, section 36(1)(5)(a) of the Income Tax Act provides that the employee's contribution to the provident fund has to be paid within the time as prescribed by the respective legislation. That is, if the Provident Fund Act prescribes certain time limits, it has to be followed. And if the time limit as prescribed under the Provident Fund Act has not been followed, and if the deposit is made beyond that time, then this amount is liable to be added to the income of the employer. And in spite of section 36(1)(5)(a) being on the statute book, in the case of Elom Extrusion and Vinay Cement, Calcutta High Court and Supreme Court had taken view that if the amount is paid within the due date of filing of return, then notwithstanding section 36(1)(5)(a), the amount will be eligible for deduction under section 43B of the Income Tax Act. And this is what we had been following, though there are litigations on this point. In virtually every case, the CPC was doing adjustments in relation to this point, and a lot of people would have filed the appeal in relation to this particular issue. Now, what has happened is, in this finance bill, or rather Finance Act 2021 has inserted one explanation 5 to section 43B. And explanation 5, what does it say? I am reading the explanation. It says, for the removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that the provisions of this section shall not apply and shall be deemed never to have been applied. Mind the language, please. Shall be deemed never to have been applied to a sum received by the assessee from any of his employees to which the provisions of section 224 subclause 10 applies. So basically, in order to get over the judgment of in order to get over the judgment of and we
Ranjita, please mute.
So,
in order to get over the judgment of Supreme Court, this explanation has been inserted. It is very clear. And now, when I laid stress on the language during while reading, a simple reading of the language, it appears that this is a retrospective amendment, because it says shall be deemed never to have been applied. So this explanation has been inserted from 1/4/2021. But friends, here I have found one decision of, there is a decision of Hyderabad Tribunal has taken a view on after the amendment. In fact, sorry, Visakhapatnam Tribunal, no, just a minute. There is one decision I am not readily before and me, but there is a decision, yeah. It's a Hyderabad Tribunal reported in 2021, 128 taxman.com, 192, where Hyderabad bench of the ITAT has considered the amendment which was made from 1/4/2021, and there it clearly said that the provisions cannot be applied, this explanation cannot be applied retrospectively. If at all it has to be applied, it should be applied only prospectively from 1/4/2021, that is for assessment year 2021-22, which is my view is also that it cannot be applied retrospectively. That's one. Secondly, I am asking a question to myself and to this august house, including Sanjay Da is also, I can see is there, that can the legislature by an explanation introduce a provision like this, whereby for a fault of say 1 day in depositing the provident fund amount which I have collected from the employees, even a 1 day delay in deposit, can the legislature say that we will treat this amount as your income, notwithstanding the fact that you, after collection you have deposited the amount after 1 day's delay, and I will be subjected to make a payment equal to 30% or 25% tax on the amount which I have collected. In my humble submission, I don't think that this can be done by the legislature, even by way of an amendment to the law, because in any case, the Income Tax Act is an act which seeks to tax the income under Article 265 of the Constitution of India, read with the list, read with the union list, where the union government has the power to collect taxes on income. Can it be said that the amount which I have paid with within 24 hours of the due date, I will not be eligible to get the deduction of this amount, and it will be, I will lose the right to get the deduction forever? I don't think so, because this issue is definitely going to be challenged before the courts of law, and on this ground itself, that if you seek to collect tax on an item like this, this is not an income, and even by way of a deeming fiction, you cannot make an item which is not an income at all, which has not come into my hands. If you see Surji Ballabh Das 46 ITR, Supreme Court said item when you can make an item of receipt as income, it should either come to me or it should accrue to me. Either of the event must happen. So in this case, can it be said that it has come to me? It had come to me for one day. Next day I have paid after 24 hours delay. So can Surji Ballabh Das case be, can I not take shelter behind 46 ITR Surji Ballabh Das? It is not an income at all. How you can make a rigorous provision like this by inserting an explanation and saying that it will be treated as your income? I don't think so. In my humble submission, this is one thing. Here again, while the auditor is reporting on this point, auditor's hands will be tied here, friends, of course. All these arguments which I am placing before this August House, the auditor cannot bat on behalf of the SSE in his audit report, I think, to this extent. But here, judgment, prudence needs to be exercised while reporting under this, in respect of this particular item also. This is my feeling, friends. Then, friends, again, there are few other points which are, while reporting on those points, needs caution from the angle of auditor. One particular clause is 28 and clause 28 and 29. 28 deals with the reporting regarding 56.2(7)(a) and 56.2(7)(b) is where the SSE received any consideration for issue of shares which exceeds the fair market value of shares in section 56.2(7)(b). Basically 56.2(7)(b), if I remember correctly, is regarding the companies who have been issuing shares at a premium, at an astronomically high premium. In that relation, section 56.2(7)(b) was introduced. So, whereby if the shares were issued at a premium which was higher than the FMB, then the difference is chargeable to tax under section 56.2(7)(b). And the auditor is supposed to report whether during the previous year the SSE received any consideration for issue of shares which exceeds the fair market value. Here again, friends, it is such a subjective area, because if you see the rules for fair market valuation of the shares, it is 11U, 11UA, all those rules are there, where if you see the DCF valuation is also one of the permissible valuation. DCF valuation, discounted cash flow. Discounted cash flow again, friends, is such a subjective thing that what will be your cash flow in next 10 years, 20 years? If you change the figures, the DCF valuation will change. So, as an auditor, while reporting under this clause, again, he has to take adequate precautions, in my opinion, to safeguard that the reporting is being done correctly. And simply reliance on certificate or management representation, etc., should not be made while reporting under this clause, friends. So these are some of the, friends, the legal issues, so to say, in relation to the tax audit that I thought it appropriate to discuss with the House. Now I will discuss few important points which a tax auditor must take into account while discharging his role as a tax auditor. What are those points? I'll come to those points one by one. The first point which I have found is the incorrect filling. If you compare the tax auditor's report with other financial, like if you compare the tax audit report with the audited accounts, if you compare the tax auditor's report with director's report, with the cost auditor's report, with the transfer pricing report, it will be found that there is a discrepancy between the two reports. Therefore, either the tax audit report is incorrect or the other report, maybe director's report or the statutory auditor's report or cost auditor's report, is incorrect, because both the reporting cannot be correct at the same time, because they are giving two different versions in respect of the same item. How it is that? I'll give you few examples. Say, director's report, which is framed by the directors of the company. Director's report gives certain information regarding the, say, employees, number of employees. And the tax auditor has disclosed in its tax audit report the amount of eligible deduction under section 80JJAA regarding employment of new employees to which the SSE is eligible. I have found that two different numbers are given in tax audit report and director's report. Both of them cannot be correct at the same time. And when you are, so therefore what I mean to say is, when you are, because you are required to give the amount to which the SSE is eligible to claim deduction under various sections, you are sitting in the chair of assessing officer. You are required to compute the deduction to which it is eligible. So therefore, when you are doing this task, it is the duty of the tax auditor to see to it that there is a no discrepancy from these kind of reportings. This is one example I gave. Again, say let us take for example cost auditor's report. Cost auditor has given his report regarding method of valuation of work in progress, and in the tax audit also you have given the method of valuation of work in progress. In the financial audited accounts, the statutory auditor has given the method in the significant accounting policies. Now, ideally, the reporting in all the three places should be uniform. If it is not uniform, then if I am the tax auditor, I am supposed to see that I am supposed to see the cost auditor's report also on this point, the significant accounting policy, and thereafter I am supposed to report regarding this particular clause while I am giving information in form number 3CD, and see to it that there is no discrepancy or variation in the reporting. at least from the tax auditor's side. Again, friends, another example is the details of outstanding demands. There is a statutory auditor's report, I think. Details are required to be given regarding the undisputed demands which are carried in appeal and all. I think under CARO there is a requirement. And similar requirements are there in tax auditor's report also. So here also, friends, there has to be a uniformity. This is simply a method of comparison and between the two things. Otherwise, there will be a huge gap between the two reporting. Then, friends, addition to say fixed assets. The figure of addition to fixed asset as per the audited balance sheet and that as per the depreciation schedule which we are giving in the tax audit report. Both the figures must tally. If they don't tally, then it is again a cause of concern. So basically, what I mean to say that this cross tally of the reporting has to be seen not only from the books of accounts, because what generally the auditor will do, auditor will tally from the books of accounts, but whether it tallies from other reports and other statements and other particulars, that is generally not done, but it should also be a part of the audit exercise while reporting in form number 3CD. Then, friends, one of the point which came, was noticed is regarding a joint audit. Suppose if the auditors are the tax auditors are joint auditors, which is very well possible. In such a case, in case of a joint auditor, the uploading of the report on the income tax website, there is no mechanism where by two auditors can approve. There is a defect, I will say, in the software. Moreover, in the income tax return also, you see the name of the tax auditor is required to be given. There is no way the name of 2 or 3 joint auditors can be given in the income tax return. Neither the approval of the form by 2 auditors can be done. This is a mistake which has been acknowledged by appropriate authorities. Hopefully it will be corrected, but as of now, in case joint auditor is there, then I think it will be appropriate that a physical copy of the report duly signed and sealed is kept by both the auditors, and it is decided by way of a resolution or by way of an understanding between the auditors that this auditor's name would be given in the return form, or by approving the form number 3CD while uploading the form in the income tax website. It would be appropriate in my opinion. This may be a very technical issue, but this should be taken into, but this should be kept in mind, friends. We are handling one case, friends, let me tell you in this connection, where one of the auditor who had signed the physical report did not upload the report online, and he died. So the report has not been, we have not been able to upload the report till date because the auditor is no longer there. We don't have his digital, we cannot use his digital signature and upload the report. So therefore, these technical aspects will come in handy in case anything of this sort is there. Then friends, another point of important point is regarding deferred revenue expenditure. As all of us know, in Income Tax Act, there is no concept of capital deferred revenue expenditure. An expenditure is either capital expenditure or revenue expenditure. And it is to be allowed at suppose I have taken a plot of land on lease. Then notwithstanding that I have paid lease rent for a number of years in advance, it will be deductible in 1 year only instead of being allowed on a deferred revenue concept. There are decisions on this basis. But in some of the reports, it has been seen that auditors have said that this amount is allowable on a deferred revenue basis. They have proportionately said that this amount is to be allowed on this basis. Then friends, another point is regarding the audit report, form number 3CA and form number 3CB. Form number 3CA is the audit report. As we know, in case where the accounts of the business or profession of a person have been audited under any other law. So therefore, if a company has got its accounts audited under the Companies Act, then and its tax audit is done, then the auditor will issue the audit report in form number 3CA. Whereas if the accounts have not been audited under any other law, then the audit report form is form 3CB. It's very simple, all of us know. However, suppose in case of a company which has been amalgamated, in pursuance of amalgamation, say a tax audit is done of the amalgamated entity for the purpose of requirement of section 44AB only. In such a situation, what will be the relevant form to be used? Will it be form number 3CA or form number 3CB? I think it will be form number 3CB. Even though it is a company, but the audit, tax audit has been conducted in pursuance of amalgamation in order to present the consolidated tax audit report before the assessing officer. That is why it should be in form number 3CB, not in form number 3CA. Then friends, invariably there is a requirement in tax audit form that audit has been conducted under which clause. 44AB, there are several clauses, I think, that 44AD, 44ADA, all those clauses are there. While reporting under that clause, invariably it has been found that there is a mistake in reporting, that the audit is being conducted under which clause. Then, even though there are no books of accounts prescribed under section 44AA, but the auditor writes that books of accounts as per 44A have been prescribed. While reporting under that clause, he says yes, reporting is books of accounts are prescribed, which is again not correct. 44A has to be properly seen. Then regarding the reporting in relation to TDS in form number 3CD, there is a voluminous requirement of reporting. And in case of a big company, this can be a very meticulous task. It is not virtually impossible for the tax auditor to verify each and every deduction and to report on that. Invariably, it has been found that going by the reporting in the tax audit report itself, one can find that there was a delay in payment, but it has been reported that there is no delay, because it is very it is natural, one can miss some dates. So this aspect, while reporting in relation to TDS, one has to be very, very careful, friends. Then friends, another thing which we have found is that the information which is being given by the tax auditor in its report, when I spoke about the cross verification has to be with the books of accounts, no doubt, and the other reports which I said. But the cross verification should be done with the reporting in the website of the company also. Website, what information has been disclosed, whether that is in synchronization with the tax auditors reporting or not. That is also one of the point to be taken. Then friends, it may appear to be a very trivial issue, but in this information technology friendly way in which the department is functioning now, where the email address and the mobile number is becoming the means of communication. It is no longer now the physical notices which are being given to the SSCs. We are all now getting SMS, emails, and once the department has sent you the email and SMS, department is now free that we have properly done the service. Day in and out, we keep on coming across cases where the email has come 6 months ago, but it has gone to the junk mail, and you have not seen the junk mail. You see the junk mail all of a sudden after 6 months, and by that time the limitation period has already expired to take action on those. So therefore, it is important that in the tax auditor's report or in the return, when information regarding the address, email address, mobile number, etc. is given, that should be of an important functionary of the organization and should not be that of a casual person. Otherwise, this is going to be a very big trouble in this information technology days, friends. Out of my experience, I am telling that a lot of SSCs are facing difficulty in having not taken adequate precaution in this particular area, friends. So that's all, friends, for the day. I think I have completed my deliberation. Now I am ready for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patodia. It was a very nice deliberation. And I think there is one question here. Kaushik, are you there? Kaushik. So I will read out the question. Now, if salary is paid late, say after 2 months, then what should the auditor write in the form as due date? Because of this deducted from salary at the time of payment.
So therefore the question of due date is linked to the date of payment. So therefore, obviously, the date of payment, taking into account the date of payment, the due date will have to be calculated and will have to be given.
Okay, that means say the salary of June is paid in the month of August. So the date August will be given, and that means that before whatever date in September, the PF has to be deposited.
15 days time, I think, is there. In that it has to be deposited.
Before 15 September. So now the thing is that, so the month of salary, I don't remember exactly whether the month is asked or not. Which month's salary is this? If that is the case, then it will be a bit of a problem.
I think they are asking what is the due date of payment as per the provisions of the relevant act. That is the date they are asking.
Acha, Buddhadev Banerjee's question. As per guidance, Mr. Banerjee, are you there? Why don't you read out the question yourself? Unmute yourself and read out the question. Mr. Banerjee. I think he can't listen.
So no,
Focus.
we can see the question.
You can see the question. As per guidance note on tax audit, the auditor have to provide assessees responsibilities paragraph and tax auditor's responsibility paragraph in form 3 CACB. But due to space constraint in the form, full paragraphs are not possible to insert there.
In this case, in that case, in my opinion, you should concise the relevant paragraphs so that it can be fit into the relevant space if possible. If it is not possible to fit the same into that, then one can write that I am not able to write the responsibility paragraphs, etc., because of the space constraint, but the same is appearing in the physical form, which has been duly signed by me and kept with the SSC. That should be done in my opinion.
Okay, sir, thank you. And I don't see any other question here. So, is there any other question?
Yes, yes. Am I audible? Gautam Banerjee.
Gautam, follow. You are audible.
My question is, in this financial year 2021, number of companies and audit entities have received subsidy from the government by way of contribution of Provident Fund and ESI. Some part of the employer's contribution of PF and ESI has been reimbursed by the government or shared by the government. Now, majority of the companies have not made or passed any accounting entries for this. What has happened is that by verifying the accounts, we are finding that the total expenditure for employers' contribution to these welfare funds have reduced compared to earlier year. That is how this answer came up. Now, relating to ICDS 7, which defines government grants, what should be the duty of the tax auditor in respect of these transactions?
Very good question, sir. You see, in so far as you're right, I think 1/3 or whatever 50% amount has been remitted by the government.
Yes.
Employer's contribution, which it was required to contribute.
Right.
So, for this grant is on a trading account, in my opinion, and as you said, that the companies are not doing any accounting of this, and whatever amount they are depositing with the Provident Fund authorities, say they are 50% or whatever may be, that is what is being shown by them as an expenditure in their books.
Absolutely right.
So the one way of accounting could be that the amount which it has received by way of government grant should be credited in the profit and loss account, and to that extent the amount of Provident Fund contribution can be increased on the debit side of the expenditure to give the correct picture of the amount that company was liable to contribute regarding the Provident Fund of the employees. In my opinion, the correct way would be this grossing up on both the sides instead of not accounting for the government grant itself. And this should be disclosed by way of a note if the company has not accounted for this amount, in my opinion.
That note should come in the ICDS part
The,
or in the accounts.
the ICDS part also, it will come in the ICDS also come as a neutral item, that the effect of this will be increase in profit and decrease in profit also. There will be no,
So basically it is revenue neutral.
it's a revenue neutral, but it should have been disclosed, in my opinion, in both the sides.
Okay, can I raise any more questions?
Yes, sir. Follow.
The next is the due dates of Provident Fund payment, ESI payment, as well as TDS returns have been extended in this year in certain cases for April, May, June, those months of 2020. So are these dates available? TDS returns for the last first quarter, say April, May, June, falls due by 31st July. It has been extended, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Extended to when?
Sir, for that, the ordinance came, the taxation laws amendment ordinance, which was later on replaced by the act,
Yes.
to refer to that act, I think, and subsequently the CBDT has issued notifications also.
There has been a notification. Yes.
So you have to see the notification.
Exact. Okay.
Not, I cannot immediately tell you what is the exact date, but
Okay, I'll check.
dates have been extended, and therefore those dates have to be taken into account while reporting.
Okay, I'll do that. Then the last question. In para 27A, which requires us to give the details of ITC credits, there the last column states that treatment in profit and loss account. Basically, I have not been able to understand that in case of closing and outstanding balance, or in case of opening balance, what shall be the remarks relating to treatment in profit and loss account?
You see, I am clause number 27A.
Yes.
Amount of central value added tax credits availed of or utilized during the previous year, and its treatment in the profit and loss account, and treatment of outstanding CENVAT credit in the accounts.
Yes.
Basically, you see, sir, methods of accounting, the inclusive method and the exclusive method. Like when you are, when you are doing the accounting for the sale, you are accounting the sale including GST in the profit and loss account on the credit side, and on the debit side the amount of GST you are taking as an expenditure, or you are taking the sale figure as the
Net value.
GST is being separately shown, because whatever you are collecting as GST, you are remitting, that amount, that account is not being reflected through the profit and loss account, but it's reflected through the balance sheet. Similarly, the input credit to which you are eligible, which is CENVAT or the GST input credit, that is also separately accounted for as the input credit receivable in the profit in the balance sheet. So basically, when it says its treatment in the profit and loss account, it means to say regarding this, that what is the amount of CENVAT credit availed or utilized, and its treatment in the profit and loss account. That is what this particular disclosure requirement is.
Those two questions are okay.
The one related to which auditors are facing is whether you are supposed to see the GST returns which have been filed by the client, because invariably the figures of CENVAT credit as per your books of account and the send-back credit as per your GST and network never are same.
No.
So basically one would tend to follow the figures which are there as per the books of account, unless you as a auditor, if I would have been the auditor, I have a responsibility to check that whatever input credit and the output adjustments etc. that have been made, whether they are as per the law or not. One cannot be blind to the figures of input output in the books of accounts. That is in my opinion. Yes. Yes, sir.
But my question is, those two things I have understood, that credit availed and credit utilized. But the first column and the last column, which says that opening balance and closing balance. This opening balance and closing balances are the result of the credit availed and utilized.
Yes.
So what can be the treatment of these in profit and loss? There should be no treatment for this.
No,
And
the
question,
treatment mean to say whether it is being routed through the profit and loss account or not. That's it. Because generally the send-back credit we are
ITC credit.
routing through the profit and loss account, it is being separately taken into account. But suppose if you are following the inclusive method, then this amount can appear in the profit and loss account also.
Yes, but under GST, if I correctly remember, under GST, the inclusive method is not allowed.
But
Under GST, you can only follow the exclusive method.
But under the Income Tax Act, Section 145A, kindly see Section 145A of the Income Tax Act. Just a minute. 145A, what does it says? 145A says, the explanation says, just a minute. Section 145A subclause 2 says the valuation of purchase and sale of goods or services and of inventory shall be adjusted to include the amount of any tax, duty, cess or fee actually paid or incurred by the assessee to bring the goods or services to the place of its location. So basically, Income Tax Act is asking you to follow the inclusive method. And the tax audit report, there is a requirement that effect of Section 145A, if any, on the profit and loss.
Right.
What we are doing as a tax auditor, even if the inclusive method is followed, which one has to follow as per Section 145A. If you don't follow inclusive method, then the auditor has to give the effect of this, which will be a neutral effect, because there won't be any effect on the profit and loss even if you follow the inclusive method or the exclusive method. Got my point, sir?
I got, but I have something to submit also.
Yes, sir.
Basically, this 145A was created to handle the mod VAT credit arising out of the excise duty.
Yes.
Over the years, excise duty has been abolished and GST has taken its place.
Yes.
But the law has not been changed. That is why the difficulty arises.
Yeah, exactly, sir.
The law gets eliminated, but its trail remains.
Exactly. The lawmakers don't move with the times.
Yes. Our unfortunate experience is that.
They will amend only when some court tells them that, look, this has to be changed. Otherwise, it will remain in the statute book, and the auditors will be required to.
Perplexed. Auditors will get confused more and more. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Patodia, for all the answers.
Thank you, sir.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Patodia, and I don't think there are any more questions. So I think we have come to the end of this program. Induda, are you there? Induda. Manish, you are there. Manish.
Induda is there. Induda has come back. Please
Yes, come back.
ask him. Yeah, he's
Induda.
there.
Induda, unmute yourself.
At the outset, I thank
यहाँ से तो तुमको फिगर मिल ही जाएगा, बना दो।
Induda.
We can't hear you.
Induda is traveling, I think.
As it appears, he is in a vehicle.
Yeah.
No issue, sir.
Yeah. Induda, come on. Follow.
You are
Unmute
you are
yourself.
you have to unmute yourself.
Induda, unmute yourself.
There seems to be
Gautam,
some problem.
Yeah, Gautam da, as a past president of the library, why don't you give a vote of thanks? Please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Patodia, for all the time that you have shared with us. We are thankful for the nice speech that you have given, and we stand corrected and wise enough by your speech. We will request, we will definitely look for further meetings to increase. Now Indu is available. Yes, Indu, you can take over.
तुम्हारे पास जो भी कार्ड है
But anyway, from my side, I thank you once again and hand it over to Indu.
Induda.
Hello.
Blank कर दिए.
Follow.
Thank you, Gautam da. It was great pleasure listening to you, and the question you raised was very interesting, and it was equally answered well by the speaker himself. Thank you at the outset. I thank Mr. Patodia for giving his valuable time, and I thank the participants who have joined in. We were, I think, what I could see was 36 of them, and we all and we really enjoyed. It was a great learning, I should say. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sir,
Thank you.
Sir,
Thank you very much.
for me also, I was also benefited by the
Amen.
question, Mr. Banerjee. That has added to my question list of questions.
Thank you.
Tax audit, and I am thankful to the accountants library and
Amen. Are you there?
for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and good night.
Yeah.
And
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Thank
we
you.
hope in future also
Happy
you will
Pujas
come to
ahead.
our programs. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Pujas. Enjoy yourself, but be safe.
Thank you.
But be safe. Okay, thank you and good day to all of you.